So for our first talk of the day, we'd like you to all think about your favorite programming language, your favorite frameworks, and everything that you love, and how you're going to change the world and make it a better place, especially with all the places you're going to go, because everyone is open to your ideas and we love you terribly. That, or maybe I'm a little bit too optimistic, and Sean is about to give you, insight into how the real world works, so that we can all feel the love and caring from all those large companies that want to hire us once we get out of college. Ladies and gentlemen, Sean O'Brien.
So hi everyone, my name is Sean O'Brien, and I live in Pasadena, California, home of the beautiful Rose Bowl. And up until last week, I was a developer at Yahoo, where I'd been for about 2 years, building tools mostly using Ruby on Rails, which is not a supported platform at Yahoo. So I'm going to talk to you a little bit today about what I learned doing that and what were some of the issues I ran into. But also a lot of this stuff applies when you're launching any kind of an application within a large organization. There's a certain checklist that they make you run through, and so I'm going to talk a little bit about that and how running an unsupported platform makes that a little bit more difficult. So when I say development standards, what am I really talking about? And what you'll find is that a lot of organizations have a documented sort of best practices that they like their developers to use. So I'm going to talk a little bit about that. I'm going to give you a little bit of a 2-minute overview of Sarbanes-Oxley, which is has to do with the tool that I was brought in to develop. I'm going to talk a little bit about development practices at Yahoo when I was there, and then kind of launch into how do you actually get an application off the ground, and not just specifically a Rails or an unsupported application, but really anything that you want to kind of push out the door. And then I'll kind of leave a little bit of room at the end for questions. So keep that in mind. So when I say standards, I'm talking about sort of these documents that have that list sort of the approved practices and platforms, and those can list anything from programming languages to use, how to deploy your application, what are supported databases, things like that. And they kind of vary from organization to organization. Some of them are very rigid and outline things like how to store customer credit card information, or how you should store customer privacy, private data. But some of them are more of just a collection of kind of things not to do, and things that they will hit you for. But most really good ones kind of track standards through their life cycle at an organization. Starting from like an experimental standard, through an emerging and an approved or a required standard. And then they also kind of touch on how a standard is kind of sunsetted at an organization. They may give a timeline of when a specific database version is going to be no longer supported. And so those are kind of good things when you're planning out an application to look at. If you develop now on MySQL 4, is that going to be not supported by Q2 of next year? So kind of take a look at those when you start and figure out what you want to do from there. So what are some of the benefits? Besides that standards are great, and everybody knows this, companies have found that having these kind of things in place produce applications that are faster to develop and easier to maintain. Productivity is kind of the big executive keyword there. They want more productive programmers. But why? Why should they standardize? Well, the big question to ask is, what if you yourself are hit by a bus? Or worse, they send your job, offshore. They want to be able to take everything that you've done for the last 2 years, all the time and the money that they've invested, and hand that off to somebody else who can jump right in and kind of run with it. But the big thing to consider here is what happens if you just don't come back? If you just decide, hey, Friday's my last day, good luck. They want to make sure that you've documented, how you built your application. They want to make sure that somebody else can jump right in and take over. So they're a form of insurance, if you will, for companies that, hey, we're going to spend all this time developing your application, and we want to make sure that we're going to be able to utilize it once you're gone, that it's going to have a life span beyond your time at the company. So when I started at Yahoo, Yahoo had been using PHP almost exclusively since 2002. There are a lot of systems built for the advertising world, that you may have heard, like Panama and Apex and things like that. And a lot of those types of things are built using Java. But for the most part, just about everything at Yahoo is built using PHP. Aside from that, Yahoo's exploring some standard PHP frameworks. A big one that they're looking at is the Symfony project. But aside from saying, here's the language that we use, here's some libraries that you're required to use, there's not a real set sort of skeleton application, if you will. So Yahoo's kind of forked the Symfony installation and created this YSymphony package that has a lot of Yahoo-specific extensions built in. Things like authenticating against yahoo.com. Oh, is that my phone? Sorry. So things like authenticating against yahoo.com, or maybe some sort of security extensions, input sanitization, things like that. And so they've bundled them all up nice and neatly into this one package. And I looked at that when I started, but I'll talk a little bit later about why it really didn't work for me. So I wanted to talk a little bit about Sarbanes-Oxley. And Sarbanes-Oxley was the act passed in 2002, kind of after the WorldCom and Enron scandals. And what it does is it sets new and kind of enhanced standards for publicly traded companies. And it covers everything from auditor independence, corporate governance, internal control assessment, and enhanced financial disclosure requirements. And what they found was that if they actually threatened executives with hard jail time and made them sign a document every quarter that said, we promise that this is accurate and that we're not lying about these numbers, companies actually operated a lot more openly and were not able to kind of pass the blame. The CEO couldn't say, oh, it was the CFO who did it. I had no idea where these numbers were coming from. And because of that, SOX within an organization is a pretty powerful sort of force. You don't want to be the guy responsible for sending your CEO to jail for 15 years. And so with that, you can kind of get away with a lot of stuff, in the name of SOX. And like I said, it covers everything from governance and auditor independence. Because what they found were that not only were the companies lying, but it was kind of shady between the relationship between the external auditing firms that were coming in and approving these numbers. So it's actually been a really big industry for consulting firms, like your Ernst & Young and those types of guys who have these external SOX certification programs, and they make quite a lot of money. So I was brought in 2005 to develop what was later called the YAMS tool. And one of the SOX requirements at Yahoo was that on a quarterly basis, each user's privileges to a certain application or host or a database needed to be reauthorized by that user's manager. And what they would find is that sometimes users would change jobs, change functions. Sometimes they'd leave and they'd never get removed from the system, things like that. So the SOX, the SOX control wanted to make sure that the people who were there should have access, and that it was relevant. And what will happen is at the beginning of the year, the compliance department will actually take a list of any application or any host that can have any kind of material impact on those financial reports. And they'll then decide which of the applications need to be tested each quarter. The testing can involve anything from individual application privileges, pseudo-words access on a specific host, or sometimes it's read-only access to a database, sometimes it's only people with admin privileges on a database. Whatever the case is, they would take all this information, grab the list of users with those privileges, and then do something along the lines of opening up like a bug ticket, finding out who that user's manager was, and assigning it to that manager to say, hey, approve this access. We were doing about 30,000 individual access items each quarter. And an individual user may have 10 of those. So you can imagine these were a lot of bug tickets that were opened, and a lot of them just kind of sat there. And the manager wouldn't do it or wouldn't see it or whatever. And at the end of the 2-week period, they would have to come in and revoke all of those users whose managers never made the appropriate approvals. So you had people constantly requesting access again, to get their access back. So a lot of the system owners would actually take longer than the 2-week, specified by the control, and do like manual authorizations on it. You call up the individual users and say, hey, can you get your manager to do this? And it was really sort of a time waste. So the YAMS tool kind of automated a lot of that. We took that same evidence list that they had, and we loaded it up in the tool, had a mapping of users to managers, and kind of sent out these automated emails saying, hey, you have 2 weeks to approve this access, and if you don't, we're going to revoke it. And we sent a couple reminder emails that got nastier and nastier as the end of the 2-week period approached. And then at the end of the 2 weeks, we'd take all the items that were not explicitly approved, send those back to the system owners and say, okay, revoke any of these guys. And a lot of times you may have had, like I said, users who had left the company and still had access to systems, or their managers just never logged in to do it. So the system was actually really basic. Load up the evidence, obtain the approval from the manager, but the key was that there was a really aggressive sort of implementation timeline. And I had basically a 3-week window from when I had a sort of a basic functioning prototype to when I had to actually launch the application and run through the quarterly process. So it kind of complicated my decision, which I'll talk about next, of why I kind of chose to go with Ruby on Rails. I was one of the main reasons I was actually able to develop this prototype really fast, in a matter of a couple of weeks from after gathering all the requirements and kind of messing around with a few different platforms. I was able to have something actually functional and users could approve and deny requests in a matter of 2 weeks or so. Rails also had a much more thriving kind of user community. There were more mailing lists, IRC channels, message boards, things like that. And there were a lot more code examples. I could pick through something and kind of see how other people had done things, and it really kind of helped me move pretty quickly. Aside, I kind of joke, all the cool kids were doing it. But I had a lot of friends that were actually using Rails at big companies, with big applications, and so those were kind of resources that I was really able to tap. If I had an issue, if I had a bug with something, or ran into something I didn't know how to do, I could call those guys up, and show them what I was working on and see kind of what they thought. And the question I was asked after implementation was, why didn't I go with something like Symfony, right? Which was a Rails-like platform for PHP. And at the time, the Y Symfony package that we had was really focused for front-end applications. And when you're developing a front-end customer-facing app, you're going to have different requirements than a back-end tool that may be used by a few hundred people. And to be honest, there were over 400 files in the empty kind of skeleton project. And I felt like the workflow was a little strange. I was editing a YAML file and then running some task to generate an XML schema from that, which then I ran another task to create the database structure. Whereas with Rails, it was just create a migration, create a table, and off it goes. And again, Y Symfony featured a lot of XML config files. It felt like I was doing nothing but editing config files. Rails seemed to have a handful of them in the config folder, and they were all nice, pretty YAML files. So, short answer is it was easier for me at the time to implement this with a hard deadline that I had approaching, to implement this in Rails. And I'll talk about it a little later, but it probably wasn't the best idea. So what does it take to actually launch, an application, even if it's an unsupported platform? Well, most of the time you're going to have a checklist that looks something like this, right? You're going to have a security review where you're going to sit down with one or more security analysts who are going to ask you a questionnaire. Depending on the organization, you may also have a risk assessment step that you have to go through. You're going to have an architecture review where somebody's going to review your system architecture, your database relationships, and so on. You're going to have to get some sort of BCP certification. What happens if your app loses a data center? Does your app continue to function? You're going to have to package everything up into some sort of deployable, repeatable, automated package. And then you're going to have to actually kick that deployment off. Anytime you're using an unsupported platform, you have to run through all of this and much more. A lot of times if you're using a standard sort of company-supported platform, they'll have various tools and various packages you can utilize to cut a lot of these steps out. And when you're using a supported platform, a lot of times the questionnaires are pretty standard. You'll go through, and anytime you answer yes or no to a particular question, they may have follow-up questions based on that. But when you're using an unsupported platform, you have a lot of follow-up questions. So it can take a lot of time, and people aren't going to be very, very accommodating to you. So the first kind of step I went through was a security review. And I was kind of lucky when I launched in that I found at Yahoo, the security analysts are called paranoids. And I found a paranoid who was actually wanted to work with me, wanted to review a Rails application, thought that a lot of people would be coming forward with these types of things, and he was really excited about it. And I found later on that was kind of the exception to the rule. But my advice for kind of working through security reviews is to find a security analyst that you like working with, that you think is intelligent, and engage them as early and as often as possible. They're going to have a lot of questions, whether it relates to how you're storing data, what kind of data you're storing. And the earlier you can get them in, and the earlier you can show them anything, they may be able to save you a lot of time, 3 days before implementation. But be prepared. They're going to ask you a lot of questions about specific sort of hot topic security issues. If you're using a supported platform, they're going to have certain development libraries and standards. They're going to help kind of mitigate some of these risks. But if you're not, you're kind of on your own, to make sure that you're sanitizing all your input. They're going to talk to you about cross-site scripting and request forgery vulnerabilities. They may even have some sort of automated tool to hammer your application looking for cross-site scripting vulnerabilities. But they're also going to have a basic kind of security stack that they're going to have blessed. And one of the things they talk about a little later is try to stick with this. They will have a certain version of Apache that they want. It may not be what you want to use, but they're not really the kind of guys to argue these types of points with. Same with the database versions and any type of crypto type stuff that they specifically own and develop and bless. They're going to want to make sure that you're either using or have something similar in place. And again, my security analyst was actually very accommodating and very helpful. You may not be that lucky. So one of the things that security, you're kind of on your own for, running an unsupported platform, is authentication of users. And most organizations use some sort of a single sign-on functionality. That could be like an Active Directory, LDAP authentication, through Apache. It could be some sort of like CAS server, something like that. More than likely, most places I've found run some sort of mixture, some sort of customized solution. And running on an unsupported platform means you're responsible for hooking into that. And that can be a lot more complicated than you think. They're not going to like you having your own separate user authentication. They're not going to like you storing user passwords in your database, things like that. So they're going to want you on one of these systems. And so if you're lucky enough, and if they're using, say, like a CAS, the Central Authentication Service, and you can find, for example, a Ruby gem that hooks into that, great, you're all set. But like I said, more than likely, it's going to be some sort of custom service, and you're going to have to write some sort of library to integrate with that. I actually lucked out. My paranoid had actually written a Ruby library to authenticate against the Yahoo single sign-on solution. So that was kind of one item checked right off the list. But again, unsupported platform means you're responsible and you're running kind of your own. Storing user credentials. Rails by default keeps all the database connection info, including the username and password, in a YAML file in the config folder. Most places are going to have policies that prohibit storing database passwords in plain text. If you're on a supported platform, they may have a library to hook into some sort of encrypted password store. What I kind of ran into at Yahoo was that they had a service that did just that, and it had a C API, which I was actually forced to write a Ruby extension to use like 2 days before launching. So, like I said, running on an unsupported platform means you're rolling your own kind of solution. You may be lucky, you may find another solution that already exists for your platform, but the key is it may not be blessed by sort of their code reviews, and it may not be up to their specifications. So what actually really helped for me was the Rails keeps like I said, the database connection info in a YAML file. But it turns out that file is actually processed first by Ruby for any embedded Ruby that you throw in there. So what I was able to do is actually only modify, once I created the extension, modify the config file to simply pull the password out and then display it, and then it would load that up, process it, and then load the YAML config. But there was all kinds of issues around it, because the way the library worked, the password files had to be read as the root user, so there were all kinds of weird ways that Mongrel and Rails had to, the startup had to be a little tweaked to make it do that. So again, unsupported platform means you're handling all that kind of on your own. Architecture reviews. Most of the people developing these standards that you're kind of thumbing your nose at are the architects within your organization. These guys are going to be really smart, a lot of experience deploying applications, and they're going to know that they have these standards for a reason, and they know what they're talking about. So you're not going to be their favorite person. They may throw things at you in the cafeteria, but no matter how cool or how awesome it is what you're doing and how fast it works or whatever, they're not going to like it. No matter what, you're not going to wow them over. You may be lucky enough to get them to pilot your particular platform or technology, and maybe they'll use it as an emerging standard within the organization. But probably not. They're probably not going to like anything you're doing. So some tips to make it through that process is don't stray too far from the standard, right? Try to incorporate as many aspects as possible of their standard sort of approved stack. Try to use, don't just use Nginx because that's what you want to use, right? Use Apache if you can, if that's the approved standard. The same with your database choice. Don't be difficult. Unsupported platforms, this is the other thing you'll find, is they are the cause, it turns out, of every bug you encounter using the stack. Whether that's actually true or not, they will close every one of your bugs if it works with the unsupported platform. I mean, it's your job to kind of convince them that the error is with their tool. And just because you may find a fix and provide the fix doesn't necessarily mean that they'll actually incorporate that for you. So you will find a lot of works for me or won't fix bugs that you close that way. So business continuity planning is a big thing especially it's a big ITIL kind of buzzword. But what it basically means is what happens if your application goes down, right? A lot of times companies will have sort of this certification process, and this may be tied to an internal control or a SOX-related control that critical business applications have some sort of way of staying alive, so to speak. A lot of times that requires your app to be deployed in multiple data centers, in geographically dispersed locations. You probably want to document what the acceptable amount of downtime you have is. I was kind of fortunate in that the tool that I built actually only needed to run for 2 weeks at a time each quarter. Other than that, it could be we would actually pull it offline. But as long as during those 2 weeks that we stayed up, we were fine. We still had to deploy multiple data centers and create these packages. It was kind of a nightmare for a while. But one of the things to consider is if you're on an unsupported platform, things like your database failover. How do you work that? If you're using an approved platform, they'll have some sort of way of failing your database over to a second database. But the things to consider: what happens when that database comes back online? If you're on your own, you've got to script all that. You've got to take that into consideration. Deployable packages are a big thing. You can't just SCP all of your files to 10 different machines. Even if you script it with some sort of bash script or something, that doesn't count. They'll have a packaging system, and you must use it. They're also going to make you go through a recovery test every year in order to maintain that certification. And so what they'll do is they'll want you to fail over one of the data centers, and they want to watch sort of how the recovery goes, and so on. Getting this BCP certification was a big thing right before I left at Yahoo, because it was very high profile. There were a lot of systems they were finding that were being deployed with no sort of redundancy, and so there was this big executive push to make sure that each system was certified. So they actually contacted me, and they were actually very helpful. They didn't really care that it was a Rails app. They were more concerned with, how do we get it to actually just work within the system. So they didn't give me a lot of crap, and they were actually probably some of the smartest guys I met there. So performance monitoring, like availability. Within that 2-week period, it was essential that our app, especially right after the emails were sent out, that our app was responsive and that our app was available. There's nothing like getting, it actually happened to me once. We would queue up all the email messages because we didn't want 1,500 or 2,000 emails all going out at once, having everybody hitting the box, because we actually didn't have nice hardware. Because we were kind of this little stepchild of a tool, we got like crappy boxes that people no longer needed. So I had 2 Pentium 3 450s running in a old Burbank data center. So I couldn't exactly just unload like 1,500 people on these things or they would crash. So I had to stagger the emails out. And one time, I was kind of in a rush to leave for the day, so I just kind of sent them the remainder. And it was far too many. And I spent like 2 or 3 hours responding to these angry managers, and apologizing for wasting all of their precious time. So have some sort of plan in place to monitor your application. And one of the areas I always seem to forget, you have your basic ping or health checks on your database and your web and your application servers. But scheduled tasks are a big one that I think people forget. You may have a process. We had one that would pull the relationship data between employees and managers down each night. And it was set to run in like a cron job on one of the machines. And I had set like the mail to variable so that the output would go to my email, but I might have also created an exchange rule to automatically dump that into the trash can. And I didn't notice for like 2 weeks that it wasn't running. So make sure you have some sort of way to monitor that job, make sure that it's actually running, because you don't want to have to come up with an excuse real quick as to why everything's off. Dependencies within your application. This is kind of a big one. A lot of places will package up their own packages of, let's say, Perl or PHP or whatever. It could be it's kind of as simple as just tracking an RPM or a specific Debian package from upstream, but it's more than likely not going to be. It may have some sort of optimization, or a specific folder layout, but it also may have certain features or certain features that you can enable at compile disabled, for whatever reason. So if you're running your own unsupported platform, you have to roll this package yourself. And the thing to consider is you may also run into other people who are willing to help you, but you must support their platform or their target. And at Yahoo, they finally started standardizing on Red Hat, but there's a lot of FreeBSD machines. And so a couple of people that I found to help me with this required FreeBSD 4 and 6 packages. And I had A, no FreeBSD machines, and B, no use for it. But if I wanted their help, this is what I had to do. The other thing that started getting complicated was they were bundling the 32 and 64-bit packages together. So you had to compile it at the same time, package it all up, and then there would be a setting in the install to pick which flavor you wanted to go with. That was actually really complicated. And I don't know, I'd never encountered something like that anywhere else, so I don't know if it was just the way it was handled, but I kind of wasted a lot of time doing that. But you're not going to get, the important thing to remember is you're not going to get just your standard RHEL 4 like Ruby package. It's going to be really old. It's not going to get updated very frequently. And some of your Rails I don't even think will run on a 1.8.1 or whatever RHEL 4 is up to now. So you're going to have to roll your own. And so myself, as well as some of the guys from the Fire Eagle team, which is another Yahoo Rails property I'll talk about a little bit, and some of the media ops guys created this YRuby package. And it was used really, the first real need we had for it was one of the password storing library. We had to compile it against a specific sort of Ruby version. We had to make sure that if we installed just that package, the password store package, that it would actually work in the ecosystem. So we had a custom folder for consistency with, across the organization. But the thing to remember is that there's really no such thing as a spare time sort of project, right? We would only actually update the package when one of us specifically needed it. But that really wasn't good enough for a lot of people who, for some reason, felt we were responsible for updating the Ruby to the version that they wanted. And I would always think that it would, a simple, well, if you want to submit a patch, I'd be glad to accept that and, kind of push the package out. And I would never hear anything, and then like a week later, my manager would get a call from this guy's director somewhere demanding to know why we're no longer supporting the YRuby package. So then I had to explain to my manager, again, what is YRuby? Why am I wasting my time on this? And it's not really what I do. But the thing to keep in mind, especially when you're compiling your own sort of Ruby or PHP or whatever, is make sure your app has great test coverage. You'd be surprised how little changes in the build process or even minor version bumps can just completely take down your app. So make sure that you've got a really good test process in place before you start trying to run your own Ruby package. So deploying your application, like I said, it's not as simple as just tarring everything up and moving it over to the server. Even if you create some fancy shell script to do it simultaneously on 10 different machines, that doesn't count. So most places are going to have some sort of segregated environment control. And this may be dictated by some sort of either internal control. This may be a SOX requirement. And you may not have each one of these environments, but these are kind of the basic basic ones that you'll find almost anywhere. You're going to have your development environment, your QA, a staging, and then finally a production environment. And a lot of places are going to have specific controls on moving between those between those environments. When I was at a previous company, you had to, before you actually moved to the QA or the staging environment, you had to have a completely scripted installation. It was completely hands-off. You had no access to these sort of simulated production environments. The same with the production environment. You basically gave a list of packages to install, and they called you if something broke. There was no, you had no access to see what the error logs were. You could try to tell them where these logs were located. But it was a lot of work to actually move between the environments. To get a relatively complicated app, it took a few years to actually get into production. So keep that in mind. I mean, what they're really looking for is a repeatable process to move between these environments. Like I said, tarring it up is just not sufficient. So I mentioned the YRuby package, but most organizations are going to have some sort of custom packaging solution. It may be you're creating RPM files. More than likely, it's just going to be some sort of tar file with a manifest so that you can uninstall it. But it needs to be automated, unattended installations is what they're really going for. And it needs to have some sort of way to roll back to a known good state. If your upgrade fails on your production servers, you can't pull them down for 3 days while you re-image them, and start all over. There's got to be a backup process. And a lot of them are going to have multiple branch support. So you may have, a current branch, a stable, some sort of testing, and the ability to build sort of nightly packages. And these are actually, I'm not a big fan of them just because it's a skill that you really can't take anywhere else, right? I mean, you're creating what appears to be like an RPM spec file, but it's not, and it's specific syntax, and but a lot of times you'll run into scenarios where you can't run, you may not be able to run an RPM on, say, a Solaris box or something like that, or some sort of inconsistencies there. So a lot of places use these types of things. It could be on Windows. You could have a requirement to install packages on Windows. So you may end up developing these packages yourself, just like I did with the Ruby package. But the thing to also remember is you're not just developing packages for your application, or even on an unsupported platform. You're not just writing packages for your application and for Ruby. You're also creating packages for things like Rake, Ruby gems. We even had a script that would generate a package for a particular gem, because you couldn't just log into the box and install gems. You had to push those as packages that were deployable, and had to track those at specific versions. So that can be kind of a big time sink. So make sure you consider that before you start planning your deployment, make sure you know exactly what you're going to need to create packages for. So what are some other things to kind of consider? A big kind of push right now, right before I left Yahoo, was continuous integration and kind of automated build tools. Yahoo's continuous integration server was based on a product by ThoughtWorks. I took a look at it before I left, and it actually appeared to be fairly robust. It had plugins for rake tasks or for Ruby tasks, things like that. But the thing to consider is you're not going to be maintaining this CI server. You're going to be going to a specific group and pleading with them to install these plugins and to support them for you because you chose to use this unsupported platform. It may be an issue of a YP and not their problem. The other thing to keep in mind is make sure, like I said before, make sure you have really good code test coverage. There was no better sort of win than having really good, solid tests. Don't just test stupid things like whether the object responds to a certain parameter or to a certain function. Actually test the function. Test it with good and bad values. Make sure that you have really solid clean tests, especially if you're going to be making a lot of changes to the app. You want to make sure before you make any changes that what you're changing is actually tested, and so that when you make that change, your test should still pass. Code reviews. In a larger team, you're going to have weekly, maybe more frequently, reviews where everybody's going to take a look at everything that you submit, that you check in. And you're going to want to make sure that you've got tests to back all that stuff up. Because you don't want to kind of open yourself up to group sort of wrath by breaking something and having everybody point it out to everyone else the following Monday. One thing that kind of threw me the first time I encountered it was a change control board. It wasn't at Yahoo, it was the place I was before. But before I came there, I was just working in a kind of a small web hosting company. We didn't really do change control. We if we wanted to edit the router config, that was stored in a flash chip or a flash drive in the router itself. We didn't check the config into any kind of version control. We were a little sloppy. So I came to this large place and I encountered this change control process. And it took me a little bit to kind of understand what this was and why it was important. But the basic idea is that everything in your production environment is kind of locked down. And anytime you want to make a change to that, you have to open one of these requests, a change request. And it's going to ask you all kinds of questions, like what are you doing, why are you doing it, and if it doesn't work, what's your plan to restore functionality? One of the key things it's going to ask you is what is the risk, the business risk of this change. And there was an interesting story about a month or two ago. Somebody had made a change to some critical system a day or so before the launch of the new Yahoo homepage. And they had categorized it as a low-risk change. And it ended up being a rather high-risk change that failed. And people were running around like crazy, trying to figure out what's going on. They finally get it fixed. This poor guy had fat-fingered one of the config files in some router somewhere, and it just hosed traffic to the entire site. So they sent out this nice, friendly email from the executive vice president that said, more or less, anyone ever marks a critical change as a minimal risk change, you will be fired on the spot. 20 minutes to pack up your desk, don't touch your laptop, you're out of here. So kind of keep that in mind. You don't get as much scrutiny. They don't review minimal changes or minimal risk changes, but you don't want to get caught lying. So the other thing that you want to try to do is have a weekly sort of defect tracking and review meeting. Right? Know all the bugs in your queue. And what took me a long time to kind of get comfortable saying is I'm not going to fix that. It may be an issue that's a relatively minor issue. It may only affect a small number of people. It just may not be that high of a priority for you. So don't be afraid to kind of push back to the person reporting the bug and just say, hey, I'll put this as a priority 5, on a scale of 1 to, but I'll get to this when I can, right? Don't get kind of caught in the, oh yeah, next week, or next push. Yeah, they don't like that. Source code management, check everything you have into source code repository. All of your architecture diagrams, everything you have should be in your repository. Don't set up your own repository. For a long time, I've always been using CVS. And when I first got there, I thought I kind of knew what I was doing, and I said, I don't like CVS. I'm going to use Subversion instead. And like I said, I told you before, I have kind of crappy hardware. Well, one of them died, just completely died. The drive was dead. And the SA response is, well, what packages do you want me to push to get that stuff back on there? And do you have a database you want me to restore? Or I'm sorry, like a backup from the backup database you want me to restore? And I said no. I had no backups configured. And I had a lot of the stuff checked out in various places, but I did lose some files I had to recreate. So that was a lot of fun. What was even more fun was explaining to my boss why I couldn't work on something for a week, because I was scrambling to recreate the stuff that I had lost. So make sure you're using the sort of the approved source code repository. If you don't like Subversion, and you want to use Git, look into something like Git SVN. It's a great tool. Allows you to have sort of the benefits of Git, with sort of the benefits of Subversion. The other thing I wanted to talk about were daily stand-up meetings, because these are starting to become not just for development. Just any type of project meeting we had. Here's the thing. They can be run really well, and they can be really effective. But most people just try to call every meeting a stand-up meeting. And a stand-up meeting should really take like 10 minutes, right? Everybody should be standing up, talk about it, go around the room real quick, table any like long conversations for after the meeting. They can easily run like 30, 40 minutes where you're just sitting there, and it's more of like a daily status meeting. But people would include stuff like things that should go in their weekly status report, right? Like I don't care, I don't know. I don't care, about some of the issues that you're having. That should probably wait till Friday afternoon. I can read that on my way home. But Tuesday morning at like 8 a.m., like I have coffee to drink. So hopefully try to find a group that does stand-up meetings really well, or really effective, because they can be a lot of fun, and they can be really useful. But sometimes they really can't. So the big question: would I do this again? The quick answer is no. No way. It was a really short-sighted decision. And as I was compiling these slides, I kind of found myself, being really cynical about the process, and I thought maybe it was just me, right? Maybe I had a really crappy experience, and let me reach out to some people who also launched tools with Rails and see if this is just me. And no, everybody said one of the quotes was, "You'd be better off quitting your effing job. Find a place where you can actually do what you want to do, because this process is a nightmare." The Fire Eagle tool was the first real publicly launched Rails app at Yahoo. And it started as a hack day sort of a tool. So it started as like a prototype that took like a day probably or so to develop. And I wasn't involved with the actual development of the tool. I helped them out, building these packages and helping them get through some of their architecture stuff. So I can't really tell you how long it actually took to build the tool. But I want to say it was like 3-4 months to actually finish the tool and get it built. It took much longer than that to actually launch the application. They had round after round of security reviews, of architecture reviews, all because they kind of took the shortcut. And for whatever benefit they got out of it, it was kind of all that time was kind of eaten up going back over security stuff and architecture stuff. But I talked to one of the guys who's still around on the project. He just had started at Flickr, had moved within the organization. But before he could take that position, it took him 10 months to transition this to a support team over in Bangalore. So for an application that took 4 months, it took him 10 months to be rid of this thing. And a large portion of it is actually going to be rewritten in PHP so that the team can support it better. So it was almost just he said it was just kind of, unless you have a really solid team that you can dump this on when you're done, don't do it. And one of the things to consider is what happens when you don't want to write code? What if you want to, what if you want to get a promotion? What if you want to move to a new position? My most recent kind of position at Yahoo, I wasn't even doing development work. Well, I was, because I was still stuck with this YAMS tool. Every quarter, I would have to sit there and go through the bugs and run the tool and add maybe 2 or 3 enhancements, that kind of thing. But I could never get rid of this thing. And so I'd have to explain to my new boss why I was still doing this and why I couldn't find anybody to take this thing from me. So keep that in mind when you start to make a decision on what kind of platform to go with. It may be easier for you in the immediate future. But long term, it's probably going to be a nightmare. And it's, in hindsight, it really wasn't the best decision for Yahoo. It was the best decision for me at the time. I had a compacted timeline. I felt this was the only way I could actually produce results really quickly. But it ended up eating up a lot more of my time on sort of the back end, just owning this thing forever. So that being said, if anybody has any questions, I don't know.
So, are you saying big companies are bad because they have all this process that makes your life miserable, or do you just need to find the company that's doing the stuff working with the stuff that you want to do? If you really wanted like PHP, then you could work at Yahoo and do the PHP and have a professional process.
Right. No, that's exactly what I'm saying. Not that one choice is better than the other, but really find a place that works with the platform that you want to work with. I just started at AT&T last week, and they actually, it's yellowpages.com, and they do a lot of Rails stuff, and it's just kind of night and day. When you've actually got other people there doing the same thing, and you're not kind of flying under the radar. The big thing I was always kind of leery of was actually being discovered by somebody who would make a big stink about this. And when I actually found like the Fire Eagle guys and some of the guys in the media ops, it was kind of their sentiment the same kind of thing was, I don't want anyone to know that we're doing this. I don't want to be found out. I don't want to have to rewrite this thing. And it was kind of interesting to watch like the mailing list traffic. We had like a Ruby development mailing list. We had a Rails development one that would get like 1 post a year. And it might have been some guy asking a question about using YRuby or something like that. But nobody really wanted to be found out. It was kind of like hiding under a rock. So, but no, not that not that using one platform is kind of better than the other, but these standards are there for a reason, and they're there because no matter how well you do your process, 5,000 other people doing it a different way is going to be easier for the company to manage. Do I like them? Yeah. I like the idea of them, yeah. I think it like I said, it makes things easier, for me it makes things easier to shed this project, and to move on to something else. I was really tired of working on this app. So.
Okay, I have a 2-part question. The first one was, it might be a continuation of what he just asked, but it was, would you characterize your relationships with other people doing something unconventional as adversarial at Yahoo? That's the first question, and the second I'll ask after you answer, if that's okay.
What I consider my relationship with other people?
Yeah, like culturally, did you encounter a lot of kind of interpersonal difficulty doing something unconventional?
I didn't personally, but I know some of the Fire Eagle guys felt they were out of place, I think, was what they would relay back to me. But they had a much more public sort of project. They had a lot more interaction with people. I kind of didn't let people know I was running Rails, and I just kind of kept to myself. I wouldn't try to debate the benefits of one versus the other, but they obviously had to do that. They had to launch this application that they had finished, and so they had to have these kind of this is why we chose this, and kind of conversations, and I kind of got to skip a lot of that.
Okay. And the second question was, are you familiar with Drupal by chance?
Yes.
What do you think of it?
I've used it like once or twice. I mean, I really kind of had, like I said, I had just a couple of weeks to kind of take this sort of, hey, look what I did, and launch it. And so it was really just kind of a kind of spur of the moment, kind of weighing what I had. I didn't have time to kind of explore every possible kind of framework.
I've got another kind of two-parter for you. First part is, what caused you to, I guess I'm assuming if you'd known the full information, you probably would have chosen PHP at Yahoo. So kind of what situation caused you to choose something different, and what would you recommend for organizations that are setting up programs and have standards for helping their developers choose the standard environment?
I would... if I had known how difficult it would have been to transition, to get rid of this project that I didn't want to work on anymore, I definitely would have pushed back a little more to get more time. I would have said, hey, let's not launch this quarter. Let's go next quarter. Let me get a little bit more time to figure this out. Part of it, I mean, it was really kind of my fault. I was new. I didn't want to say no. I can't do this. I don't have. I can't. And I got more comfortable there, like as time went on, and I probably should have right off the bat just said, look, I can't do this. So being able to kind of have a relationship with kind of your boss to be able to say, look, this isn't possible. And for me, the hesitation was I didn't want to say, yeah, it's probably possible, but I can't figure it out in 2 weeks. So what can organizations do to? I think having more. I think the problem that I encountered was there wasn't really a clear sort of way to, other than use these PHP libraries, use these extensions. I didn't really find sort of a skeleton app, especially for an internal tool versus a front-end property. There's a lot of stuff for front-end properties. If you're going to launch, some sort of localized, Yahoo News or something like that, they have, a standard stack that they use. But for developing an internal tool where it's not as high profile, there's not as much sort of requirements on it, there wasn't a lot of information. And so I kind of had to weigh what I had on hand and, what I thought I could complete. So.
Knowing what you know now, would you prefer, if you were coming into an organization and starting something up culturally, would you prefer a more polyglot environment or a single stack mentality if you were creating an organization yourself?
Probably some sort of full stack. It just makes it easier to replace people, I think, because people come and go. While I was there, I was there for 2 years, and I saw quite a lot of people, kind of coming and going, and to be able to actually backfill that position with somebody relatively easy versus going and trying to find a position that you may not know a lot about. So it's harder to kind of weed out candidates. The other problem I kind of found, recruiters aren't always the best. And so a lot of times you have to find people that to bring in, or find resumes kind of yourself. And so having sort of a single sort of source where you can go and having lots of people that are familiar with your stack, who can recommend people, I think is pretty valuable.
So looking at the slides and each of the steps you had in there, it seems like maybe the step you missed that you've kind of hinted at figuring out at the end was exit strategy.
Right. Oh no, that's definitely true, and that's a good point. It is kind of figure out how you want to dump this thing off. Because I think the problem is when you're starting a new project, you're hopefully really excited about it, you really want to work on this thing, but after 2 years, you may be really sick of looking at this, dealing with the same, customers. You may want to do something new, and so try to figure out, how do I dump this thing off on some poor sucker. So. Okay. Thank you.